Thank you all for coming tonight. It's so good to see people. This is only the second in-person program we've had this year. My name is Nicole Smith. I work at the History Center. And I'd like to make a couple of announcements before we get started. All of our programs are being recorded and are live streamed on Facebook. So for anyone that isn't able to watch today, either in person or online, you can go to the YouTube. If you go to YouTube, to the York County History Center YouTube page, you can see all of our programs. A couple of announcements. On May 2nd, the South Central Pennsylvania Genealogy Society is sponsoring a tour of Muddy Creek Forks. Their tour is free and it starts at 2:30. On May 7th, we have Give Local York, which is a local nonprofit fundraising event. And we have a number of programs at the History Center here and online. So if you get a chance Friday, May 7th, please check that out. Now, the next Allvets speaker is Brenda Webb, and that's going to be May 26th. She was in the Army and will be speaking about her experience in field communications. Before I introduce the speaker, Linda has asked that we have a moment of silence for John Stayer, who was a regular attendee of our program. Thank you. And just for more information about the York County History Center programs or to make reservations, please visit yorkhistorycenter.org or give us a call. I'd like to introduce now Buck Buchanan, who's going to speak to you about his experiences in Vietnam. Thank you.
Thank you. Am I coming across loud and clear?
Loud and clear.
All right, very good. I spent a year as a helicopter pilot with the 1st Air Cavalry Division in Vietnam, and that's what I want to talk about. This is more to tell you about all of the pilots. It's not just me as Buck Buchanan. It's just to give you an idea of what the pilots did, how we got trained to do it, how we did our missions, and so forth. If there are questions as I'm going through, just raise your hand and I'll stop and try to answer your question. If I get lost, my PowerPoint's going to skip me back somewhat on track when we get there. I got as a commissioned officer. I went to Lafayette College. It was an ROTC. They were so desperate for pilots, I was actually able, my senior year, the Army paid for me to go to the local flight school and take flying lessons in an airplane. And they did that just to find out who had flight abilities, who was willing to go through that, or those that were going to quit. I recruited several. You had to have 5 to do that program. I recruited 4 others that thought we were good. 2 failed on the flight physicals. 2 others had one of those momentary sense of common sense that said, geez, what are we volunteering for? And it got down to just 2 of us. So I pulled a deal there, and although I was a student at Lafayette, we sort of fraudulently got me enlisted at Rutgers University. So my senior year, I was, quote, a Rutgers student, only to go to the flight program. That's what we did. As a commissioned officer, I had a lot of duties besides just flying. The other pilots were what we call warrant officers, and their sole duty was to fly. And, those are the people I'm going to talk about and what we did and how. First and foremost, the 1st Air Cavalry Division was the first Army unit that they developed to use helicopters extensively. Our troops, wherever they had to go, it was always by helicopter. And certainly when we put them in the landing zones, they had to patrol through the jungle. But they never went from point A to point B in trucks or buses or anything else. We used helicopters day in and day out to support it. And it was a very successful technique for Vietnam with the jungle and trying to find the enemy. It was so successful that the Army then took the 101st Airborne and modified them to also be an air mobile unit. So first Cav and the 101st Airborne were the two aviation total support units in Vietnam. Now, for some of you that don't remember, well, it worked when I tried it before.
Try the little arrow.
There we go. Oh, the wrong arrow.
Yeah.
All right. For those of you who don't remember Vietnam, of course, it's this is a more current map because it shows one country. If we were talking about north of Quan Tri here, this is about what was then the DMZ, developed demilitarized zone, North Vietnam versus South Vietnam. South Vietnam by the Army is broken into 4 segments. They were called corps, Army Corps. I flew for the 3rd Army Corps, or at the time I flew for the 101st Cav. We were in the 3 Corps. Benoit was an air base. That's where I lived for about 7 months of my time. It was a joint Army and Air Force base. One advantage, and I know we've got 1 or 2 infantry guys in the back here. The advantage we had as being helicopter pilots is they didn't care so much about us, but we had at that time $250,000 machines. So at night we would leave the forward areas and go back to base camps, not for our protection, but for the protection of the helicopters. So I lived in Benoit for about 7 months. When the Cav stood down, changed our mission. We then went to an aviation brigade, and it doesn't show here, but I spent my last 5 months in country at a TIE fire base. That was a U.S. Army helicopter unit, but we're actually living in and supporting the TIEs, Australians, the Arvets in South Vietnam, and almost anybody else that wanted a helicopter at that point. Time frame for the Vietnam War, quickly. You had, as far back as 1950s, U.S. advisors. We started sending in actually U.S. combat troops in February of '65. And take note, February of '65, the first combat troops, and only a few months later, you had the 1st Air Cavalry go over. They didn't get there in the initial unit because they were still going through train up, developing how and what to do with helicopters, how to utilize them, and so forth. My tour itself was July of '70 to July of '71. I flew for Company A, whose call sign was North Flag, later for Company B, call sign Killer Spades, and I spent a good bit of time as the 229th Combat Aviation Battalion Operations Officer. U.S. troops left in '72, and Saigon fell, South Vietnam fell as a country in April of '75. So it's just a quick rundown of time. If you've seen Robin Williams in Good Morning Vietnam, okay, this has nothing to do with Vietnam. Probably a funny movie, but don't in any way think there was something there that related to Vietnam. The sad numbers, I've had some people that are attending by Zoom, and one of the questions I had earlier was what was involved. 11,835 helicopters in Vietnam, of which 5,607 were destroyed. Now, the reason I had totally destroyed in red ink there is that nobody was counting how many times the helicopter got shot down, got repaired. Sometimes they had to fly the wreckage back to the base and so forth, got repaired and was returned to flying duty. Then that didn't count in these statistics. My personal experience, I was shot down 3 times. All 3 times I got the helicopter on the ground very safely. First time was I was a very junior pilot. I don't think I really knew what the hell was happening before the other pilot had us on the ground. We just cleared the landing zone, machine gun took out our engine, and in a matter of like everything's fine to what happened, we were on the ground. It was almost all over. But that's the way it happens, short and quick. The numbers, therefore, when you talk about how many were destroyed, I would say multiply that number by probably 4 or 5 times for the number of helicopters that were actually shot down. That kind of frequency. I don't know if other units had it, but in Vietnam for the Cav, we had a term, magnet ass. That was a term of pride. Right? It meant that the individual had been shot down 5 times. So you had that experience, you won the right to be called magnet ass. And I can recall at one point in time we had a magnet ass 1 and a magnet ass 2. Because there were 2 of us, not me, 2 others that had been shot down and had that nomenclature. There were about 40,000 helicopter pilots in Vietnam, and that's Army, Some Air Force, Navy, Marines have good number of helicopters, of course, but that's total. That's not just U.S. Army. Pilots killed, 2,165. Crew members. Now, pilots are the guys up front wiggling the stick, right? They're flying a helicopter. The guys behind us were the crew chiefs, the mechanics, also serving as door gunners. Of those, we lost 2,712. Fairly close in numbers. Why is that? Okay, it's because generally, if they got the helicopter, they killed everybody else. It was all or none, so to speak. There were times that they'd get a round or two into the aircraft, and maybe they'd hit a crew member, but not take the helicopter down. So that's a slight difference in numbers, but quite a difference. Toward the end, and I don't know this number of 40,000 because toward the end, my time in country, I was flying with pilots that were there on their second tour. They had done their 1-year tour, went back to the States. Usually they were used as training pilots for the flight schools. And then they were so desperate for pilots, they would send them back for a second tour. I'll come to other impacts of that later. If you really do want to know something about what it was like in Vietnam and you're willing to read a book, We Were Soldiers Once and Young, about events that occurred in November of '65. You may recognize that title also because Mel Gibson did a film on that, a movie by Mel Gibson. That is, fortunately, not one of your typical Hollywood movies where there's 10% truth and 95% Hollywood. The two authors of that book, Hal Moore and Joe Calloway, refused to give Hollywood the rights to make that movie. And Mel Gibson sweet-talked them, argued with them, or coached them for over like 12, 14 years before they finally said, all right, we'll let you do it. But those two authors were given the right to veto any scene in the movie. And they did quite a few. So that really is a realistic portrayal, both of how the infantry fought and how helicopters were used. This was very early in the war. First Cav had only been there a few months when they did that. Why I say in red ink again, tactics learned. Whoops, go back. Tactics learned. Unfortunately, the Army always seems to learn lessons the hard way, and there were a lot of hard lessons learned in the Ashaw Valley and Hibernian Valley, what to do and what not to do. And I'm sure a lot of the things that when I was there, it was routine. I say SOP, standard. What we did was day in and day out, everything worked as smooth as you could imagine, but it's because there were predecessors that all learned the hard way. Quite a difference. Okay. Where do you get helicopter pilots? Well, the Army's got a neat little trick here. They tell everybody, hey, this is a hazardous duty. You probably don't want to do this, but there's always going to be somebody out there crazy enough to do it. And that kind of an attitude gets people to say, yeah, I want to do that. And unfortunately, I was young and stupid and said, yeah, that sounds exciting. Careful what you ask for. Most of our, well, to be, Air Force and some of the others, you got to be a college graduate and all this high-tech stuff. You know, be a helicopter pilot, you just have to be dumb enough to raise your hand and say, I'm going to do it. And they take it. The average age of our pilots in Vietnam was 19 to 21. I was 24 when I was overseas, and I was called the old man at age 24. And my hairline was already receding, but you know, that was the term as a commander, the old man. But imagine 19 to 21, all right? And putting a 19 to 21-year-old kid in a helicopter is like giving him a Corvette and saying, now don't you speed, Jonathan, all right? You keep that Corvette under the speed limit. It really doesn't work. You did have to get through a very tough flight physical. I always found that ironic. To go over and let somebody shoot at you, you had to be in perfectly good shape. Doesn't make a lot of sense. That's what they want. Most of our pilots were warrant officers. Now, a warrant officer is an enlisted man that then goes into, it's an intermediate level between a non-commissioned officer and a commissioned officer. In between, you've got that warrant officer. It meant he's a specialist. The Army, because they needed so many pilots, took all these young kids and made them warrant officers. And they had the only duty they had really was to fly helicopters. You couldn't tell them, hey, you're going to run the maintenance shop, or you're going to run the mess hall, or you're going to run radio communications. Their job was to fly, and that's all they did. it did it very well. As a commissioned officer, you had other responsibilities flying. I was lucky enough for about the first 3 or 4 months to do nothing but fly. Then unfortunately I made the rank of captain. They pulled me out of flying on a daily basis, and I ran at first company operations and then at battalion operations. And I got my flying in by either doing it at night or sneaking out during the day and getting a few hours in here and there. All right, I think I skipped one or not. Yeah, all right. Flight school for primary, Fort Walters, Texas, middle of nowhere in Texas, flat plains, and always, as I flew over all of that section of Texas, I always wondered, why in the world did we fight the Indians to take possession of this land? I mean, that part of Texas is just useless, but that's where they had it, Fort Walters, Texas. We flew a TH-55, a training helicopter 55, and seriously, what we named it is Nicole Smith. Nicole being the toy maker, and Metro Smith certainly was not what it was, but that's what we called it. Little two-seater, you sat really elbow to elbow. Let me get the picture because that shows it better. Here's some young lieutenant going through flight school. You see he's got his Nomex uniform on, so if he's in a fire, he won't burn for a few seconds. This is a two-man helicopter. You literally do sit elbow to elbow. In good weather, the doors are off, so it's pretty much like sitting on a chair with a piece of plexiglass in front of you and flying around. Neat little helicopter. You see it's 3 blades, but it was a good trainer. It was cheap. It was a gas engine, so we had to learn how to. There's basically 4 controls in a helicopter. You got your left arm up and down on the throttle. You got your right arm on cyclic control where you go. You got 2 feet on pedals, and any one adjustment in one of those requires a corresponding adjustment in the other. So being a flight school, I thought I was the most uncoordinated person that was ever born. Maybe I proved it for a while, but eventually they taught me how to fly. Neat little helicopter, certainly never meant for combat, just a training device. There were times at Fort Walters, the rotation for how badly they needed pilots. As a commissioned officer, we are a class of 40, and we graduated 40 officers every 2 weeks. The warrant officer classes were about 90. They would typically lose some of those warrants. By the time they were at graduation level, there was probably about 65 warrant officers in that class every 2 weeks. Yes.
So you mean to say you had 2 weeks of training and then they said, you're ready to fly?
Different point, but every 2 weeks there was another graduating class. Okay, so every 2 weeks you had 40 officers and about 60, 65 warrants that graduated. All right, it wasn't 2 weeks of training. That's coming up. All right, great little toy there. I like that picture. Then you went to Fort Rucker, Alabama for what they called advanced flight training. First, you had to fly another training helicopter, TH-13, which to fly instruments. When you can't see out the window, you're in the clouds, you cannot use your equilibrium to fly. You've got to learn to trust the instruments, and that's the training that we did. Then very shortly after that, we trained in the UH-1, the Huey. I think if anybody thinks of what's the common symbol of Vietnam, it's the Huey. Either you flew them and loved them, or you heard them and didn't like them. I always try to remind the infantry, not only did we take you into those hot landing zones, but we did come back and take you back out. All right, so remember both sides of that story. Sometimes they only remember us putting them in. Formation flying is flying in groups and kites. Vietnam, there were times that we literally, to get into tight landing zones, would have overlapping rotor blades. And then on short funnel, we're about 40, 50 feet off the ground, we break off and find a spot to get into. Flight school was just as realistic as possible to know what it was going to be like in Vietnam. I can recall being given time to show up for training at 2 a.m. They wanted you to learn what it's like to get in the middle of the night to go out and fly. And you did night formations, night navigation, everything else to do it. So in the end, it was a 9-month school, but you had, you got to learn to train this. I can fly helicopters, but I can't train with this. 180 hours of flight school, plus an additional 50 hours in a simulator to teach you how to fly instruments. That 9 months finally got you what we call the Aviator's wings. And at that point, you were a pilot, an Army helicopter pilot. Graduation exercise was to take about 45 helicopters in a formation and fly over the post with all student pilots, right? That was our way to graduate. This is actually a picture from Vietnam, but this is about the same. These are enlisted men, probably, I think most of them were coordinators. The pilots looked about the same, folks. You know, if the individual took off his shirt and they're working on the helicopter, you couldn't tell who the warrant officer pilot versus the, the 19-year-old mechanic. They all looked alike. And they all sort of behaved alike, too. All right, I want to get into the type of helicopters we had, and I won't spend too much time on some of these. Old MASH TV show people may recognize this as the OH-13. Only 150 lost. That's because it wasn't there very long. All right, it was underpowered. It was very, very poor maneuverability. They tried using this in Vietnam, and very quickly all the pilots said, hey, this is nothing but a death trap. So they got rid of that. Other one they tried was the OH-23 Raven. I flew this out in Fort Carson, Colorado, stateside. Again, it's a nice big plexiglass bubble. Great observation, but totally underpowered. Army always seems to start next war with the old antiques from the last one. And that's what these two things were. Next we get in, specifically designed for the Vietnam War, was the OH-6 Cayuse, or what we call LOH, L-O-H, Light Observation Helicopter. Now you'll see there, he's got a respectable number of lost, the 842. This guy had two roles, either to go out and find the enemy by observation, or, this is a real selling point for a LOH pilot, to fly low level and draw the enemy fire on them. All right, so today you've got to go be a target, and we're going to see who shoots at you. And that's exactly what they did. It was a two-man helicopter. Pilot was on the left. There was a guy on the right here. Oops. Guy on the right here that was an observation. This guy would generally have a machine gun, freewheeling machine gun on his lap, so they could put a little bit of fire down if they needed to. But folks, this was the Corvette of helicopters. This thing could just, it could be hovering and it could be gone in a split second. The other unique thing, and I've never found an engineer that said it, but this was the most crash-worthy helicopter the Army ever had. I don't know if anybody designed that or not, but when these things crash, the first thing they do would break off the rotor blade. This boom would break off, and this little ball would just roll across the rice paddy. And it's amazing how these could crash, and the pilots would come out of it. All right? Usually with a funny grin on their face, but they get out. Whether you can see it or not, this is a picture of a Vietnam village with the LOH flying low level over it, trying to see what's down there. I can recall both in Vietnam or even more so in Cambodia, LOH pilots tracking somebody's footprints. They were down at a hover, 10, 15 feet off the ground, literally tracking somebody's footprints. And of course, that's really doing a good job to be a target. I did not fly LOHs, by the way. OH-58, very low number. That's because it was only there toward the end of the war. The military-industrial complex, for some reason, they thought we have to invent a better helicopter than the LOH, the OH-6. First CAD tested these. We tested them for about a month and a half and said, these are crap. You don't in any way want to use this in combat. It's junk. So what did the Army do? They stopped buying the LOHs and bought the 58s. And these are still in the Army inventory, slightly modified since Vietnam, but they're still there. Way too long of a tail boom, way too unresponsive. And I got to tell you, that gave a lot of pilots heartburn. You know, you're putting your life on the line with this OH-6, and then they give you this clunker. Tell you, all right, try to go do the same thing. What do you think about it? And of course, they ignored every write-up that they made. Now we get into the Hueys. I guess if you can say that's an honor roll, the highest number of helicopters lost in Vietnam are the Hueys, 3,254. And again, I'd say multiply that by 4 or 5 times to get a number of how many were shot down. As long as the aircraft could come in, swing load it back to the base, repair it didn't count on the statistics. Nice spit-shine polished helicopter here. I suspect this was for somebody's funeral.
All right, there's a more typical pilot in Vietnam. We had two-piece Nomex flight suits. Again, with that, leather boots and a helmet. If we crashed and burned, that Nomex would get you maybe 4 or 5 seconds of survival, but it's better than none. The real thing they did in Vietnam, they learned instead, the original fuel, JP4 jet fuel, was in a bladder, all right, and bladder would rupture, JP4 would come out, and you'd have a crispy critter. The main thing they did was they created fuel bladders that were bulletproof. They were rubberized, so a bullet could go in and come out, the rubber would self-seal. And that made a tremendous impact on the number of loss of crews due to the fires. You know, there's nothing more frustrating to do a good auto rotation, get down on the ground, and then have it ignite. So there's your typical warrant officer pilot. Crowley Hilly, pilot in command usually sat in the left seat. The aircraft was actually meant for the real pilot flying instruments to be on the right, but in Vietnam, they always wanted to put the junior pilot on the right so he had the better instruments if he needed. So the pilot in command was on the left, co-pilot was on the right. All co-pilots were basically trained to later become a PIC. Important point here, no rank in the cockpit. I went over as a first lieutenant, and for the first almost 3 months, I would go out and fly, and there'd be a warrant officer. On the ground, I totally outranked him, but when you got in that cockpit, whoever the PIC was the boss. There was no issue, no thought, no concern whatsoever. If he had to chew your butt out, he'd chew your butt out. But again, they're teaching you how to be the pilot. And that worked very, very well. I went to a reunion one time and actually ran across the guy that I thought at the time in Vietnam, he was the meanest son of a gun you could have. And when I saw him 35, 40 years later, I thanked him because I know he taught me some things that saved my life. So that role of warrant officer commission was irrelevant, and it worked very well in aviation. We had crew chiefs. A crew chief was assigned to one specific helicopter. Therefore, he knew the nuts and the bolts, and, you know, he'd say, "Hey, chief, I hear a little funny sound in the back left." "Oh, no, sir, that's been there for 3 or 4 days. I'll look at it next week. Don't worry about it." Well, he's flying in the aircraft. His life's on the line as much as yours is. So if he says it's okay, you know, you accepted that. It's okay. Most of the time. Crew chief did have an M60 machine gun on his side, and then we had a door gunner on the other side. And he'd say, "All right, what's the MOF? What's the military training for a door gunner?" There was none. We would get most of our door gunners out of the infantry. Guys that had spent a year in Vietnam would re-up. They'd extend their time in Vietnam just to be a door gunner. Wow, you can get guys to volunteer for almost anything. But they did. There's a door gunner here. He's got his M60. It's on a mount, and there are swivel points, so he cannot swivel this around to shoot down his own helicopter, right? Which is very important. However, they can't stop them from shooting out. And in fact, on one occasion, we got a crew chief got a little excited, and he put a few rounds in the other helicopter. Some nasty words went over the intercom on that, but we got through. Types of missions for a Huey: troop transport between fire bases. So we are kind of an expensive taxi cab in a lot of cases, you know, took out the people that back and forth rotation, medical calls or whatever it may be. Our real role and function, though, is to be assault helicopters, combat assaults. And I'll cover that in a little bit more detail further in the presentation. Insertions and extractions. Insertion is when you're putting the troops into an unsecure area. Extraction is when you're unloading those troops out. Logistical, we did food, ammo, water. We did that all day long. Usually more water than ammo, but then once they got in the firefight, it switched over to ammo and then water. Command and control, the battalion commanders all had their own helicopters to go out and check on their troops. We did all sorts of funny little things there with broadcasting, and the Chu Hoi program was, we'd go out with a speaker, a huge speaker, and there'd be a Vietnamese on board, and he'd be talking, and we were told he's telling the enemy, you know, we're really your friends, give up, Chu Hoi, come over as a friend and take care of us. For all we know, he was probably telling Bill that he had a little baby girl last week, or who knows what they were saying. And then we had little pamphlets that said, this is a free pass to come into the U.S. lines, and we litter them. We just throw those out the helicopter, and they're supposed to bring the enemy in as friendly. I think it failed a lot on that work because as we did this low level, we had two Cobras above us that as soon as they fired on us, the Cobras would fire back. So it's kind of like, yeah, I'm your friend, but the guy above me is going to shoot at you. For gunships, early in the Vietnam War, they didn't really have a gunship, so they took an old C model Huey, and they modified it. They put on rockets on the little pods on the outside, 2.75-inch rockets. They put a minigun in the front, and this big ball thing is actually a 40-millimeter grenade launcher. And that was the first version, kind of like a Rube Goldberg. You took a troop transport and tried to make a gunship. It didn't have the power to do all that. It was sluggish, but it had some pretty good argument. Although, look, let me go back. 365 of those lost. Now, what was built specifically for Vietnam was the AH-1 Cobra, the gunship. Okay, see how few of those were lost? The old gunship, previous slide, was only used for maybe a year and a half to 2 years. Then they came out with the Cobra. Cobra was there for years and years and years. So why only 271 losses? Because the enemy learned you don't pick a fight with the guys that kick the hell out of you, right? So that Cobra was one mean machine. Again, it had the rocket pods here. You can see they added extras here, and there's the same number on the other side. And again, both the minigun and the chunker. One hell of a good armored aircraft. There's a typical flight of two. They always flew in a flight of two. The reason for that is if a helicopter's on a gun run coming down to the enemy, at some point he's got to break off. And as they break off, they basically stop firing. They expose their body to the enemy, and they got to get away. The second helicopter would then be, as soon as the first one went to break off, the second helicopter would start the next gun run. And mission, attack by attack, they kept getting lower and lower in elevation. Eventually, that would break off. But a pair of Cobras really did do a hell of a job to support us. Excellent job. Those guys could always get a free beer at the club. I guarantee it. Because usually they did something to save your butt. Sad thing to see a Cobra sitting in a junkyard, but I really wanted this picture so you can see the pilot sat tandem. So this is no more than about not even 3 feet across. I can't recall the exact dimension, but it's basically elbow to elbow. And you're sitting there, one pilot in the front and the gunner behind you. That's not a very big target, especially when you think at the same time you're looking at that, he's putting off all those rockets or miniguns or whatever it may be downstream towards you. So tremendous helicopter. Crew of a Cobra was a pilot in the front seat, gunner in the back seat, although if the pilot was shot, he had kind of a funny little method to try to fly the helicopter. Not very good that way, but at least he could get back to land. Unfortunate thing for the crew chief on a Cobra, there's no seat for him. So you had a guy that did all that maintenance, all that work to maintain it, and in the morning he'd watch the pilots fly off. Now you'd think most guys would say, oh man, have a good day and I'm gonna stay back here. Crew chiefs are all upset. I want to go with him. I want to go with him. I don't want to be left behind. Weapon systems, the 2.7 millimeter minigun. That minigun, by the way, if you put a target in a baseball field, in a matter of about 40 seconds, it can put one round in every square foot of that football field. It fired that many rounds per minute. So they usually didn't have to fire a full minute, but it could really kick butt. Okay, types of missions for the Cobras. First and foremost, they were escorts. Anytime we were out as a combat assault, flight of 10, we always had 2 Cobras with us, guaranteed every time. If we were going into a known hot LZ, they'd add more Cobras, depending on how hot it was and what we knew about the enemy situation. So they were there for all our insertions and extractions. They prepped the landing zone before we went in. Either they'd fire on the likely spots, or if we were taking fire, we'd immediately call the location, and those Cobras would be putting suppressor fire on the enemy in a matter of seconds. Now, again, funny story is, we were taking fire on the right. I remember calling for the Cobras that fires on the right, and just a few seconds later, the fire's on the left. Cobra pilot has his minigun on the right, walks it across to the left, and didn't take his finger off the trigger and shut off my antennas. At the time, we thought it was ground fire, and then we got back to we lost Buchanan, got back to the base and the mechanics called up to me and said, what did you say happened again? Well, we got ground fire. I said, those bullet holes are from the top down. So that night, the cover pilots got me some beer. Time check. Grandson, are we
Not 45 minutes.
not 45 yet?
I want to know what's going on.
Okay, good. Thank you. We're doing all right here. Now, folks, that doesn't mean you can't ask questions. You know, if there are questions.
Does the Marines still use covers?
The Marines do, and in fact, the Israeli use covert, and the Israeli pilots come to 40 down to get the qualifications and training. Marines have gotten the 2 engines and some other things. We always flew single engine. The Army made you sign a contract that if this engine quits, I promise to land. All right, and we all followed it. Okay. Chinook. These guys are good pilots. They're proud of what they do. I look at that and think it looks like a big school bus painted green. That's exactly what it was. It was a major troop transport. It was used with the ram in the back. You could actually drive 3 Jeeps into that Chinook, and it could pick up and fly off. We didn't do it very often, but it was neat for air shows. The real mission for the Chinook was this hook right here. And they could pick up, and they would move any of the artillery pieces, they would move bulldozers, they would move, you name it, and they could pick it up and move it from point A to point B. And of course, why did the cab do anything by helicopter? Because if you drove down the road, you're totally exposed to being ambushed. Not too many ambushes in the sky, per se. Sideline here, the other thought we always had, this is an internal joke with pilots, we always said, big sky, little bullet. And that somehow made you feel good, right? I mean, big sky, how's that little bullet going to find me? But, they did. Chinooks, early on in the Vietnam War, in the Yasha Valley, the first cab tried to use that as an assault helicopter. Loaded up 34 troops and a crew of 4, tried to take it into Yasha Valley and got shot down. You lose 38 troops in one crashed helicopter. That's pretty sad. So that little experiment didn't work. Was never to be done again. And unfortunately, talk about corporate memory. In Afghanistan, a Chinook was used up into the enemy position, and again they lost the Chinook and the entire crews that were on board. So, corporate memory. They didn't ask the old vets as to what to do and what not to do. 132 lost. Another unique thing. This was based on a question I had one time. You'll see there's 2 engines, but I had somebody pretty sharp said, "Where's the transmission?" Well, the transmission's back in here, but there's only 1 transmission. Why would you have 2 engines and 1 transmission? Because these rotor blades intermesh. So if you had 2 transmissions and 1 engine went out, and 1 set of rotor blades slowed down and the other didn't, you'd be an egg beater, beating yourself to death. So there are 2 engines, but there's only 1 transmission for them. The other disadvantage of the Chinook, it had so much hydraulics, you could almost shoot almost anywhere and you get a hydraulic line. And of course, you lose your hydraulics, it's like losing your power steering on a car. Only you can't manhandle a helicopter without that power. There's different procedures for that. Okay, so the missions for CH-47s, pilot left seat, co-pilot, both right, crew chiefs, maintenance, and they were basically weight and balance. They had to know what to bring on board. They watched the sling loads. Sling load has a tendency to start vibrating as the helicopter is flying along, the air currents and so forth, and then they have to control it. Or in fact, I wish I had a camera the one day I was lucky enough to see. They were moving an outhouse, a 12-man wooden outhouse, and it got caught in the slipstream, and they had to punch it off. Well, they were at about 2,000 feet, and this thing just came apart on the way down. Fortunately, it was over the jungle, so nobody was underneath. I should have had a camera. Types of the missions, primary logistics. Now, being a assault helicopter pilot, we would derogatory and call them ash and trash missions because that's what they did. They haul stuff back and forth. Now, the one thing they did do that was really nice is when we got shot down, They were the big brother that would come over and ring out the helicopter, pick us up by the main mast, and fly the helicopter back to the base here. So on those nights, they got beers too. Not many of these 9 lost. This was a crane. It was, and I believe it is still the world's largest heavy lift helicopter. And in fact, just last week, I saw a picture of cranes dropping fire retardant in California, trying to put out a fire. Guaranteed that is an old Vietnam airframe, still going. I did mention it, but when we were back on that CH-47, whether you've seen it or not, but there's a very famous picture in Afghanistan of a Chinook with this ramp touching the roof of a building, and they're unloading stuff while this helicopter is just hovering there with the ramp on the building. Nobody's seen that? Well, it was a Vietnam helicopter, air pilot, on another tour out of the Pennsylvania Army National Guard that did that. So some of our pilots were flying a long time. You know, it gets into your blood, it's hard to give up. Okay, daily life of a pilot. They flew almost every day. There was no guarantee, there was no such thing as Monday to Friday. I mean, most pilots have no idea what day of the week it is. They know the date because you had to put that in the logbook. And they were always counting down on how many days they had left in the country, but they generally didn't know what day of the week was immaterial. By Army regulations, a pilot could fly 120 hours a month. And that's a lot of flying. Your commercial pilots, I think, fly about 30, 35 hours a month. So Army pilots were flying 120 in combat, kind of stressful. The irony is every time the Army writes a regulation, there's a next rule or a next sub-heading. If they needed to exceed the 120 hours, they could get a checkout from a flight surgeon and you could add another 20 hours, okay? And how qualified was that checkout? Well, I used to load, 8 or 10 pilots into the deuce and a half, driving down to the flight surgeon. They'd walk through the building, tell them their names, walk out. And that was the flight surgeon. Yeah, they're good to fly. They could walk through the room, they could still talk, they're good to fly. So you throw another 20. So most of the time, our pilots are flying up to 140 hours a month. We're actually required to keep a 30-day chart that had all the pilots and what days they flew and how many hours. And you'd have senior staff come in and they'd check that mathematics to make sure there wasn't somebody flying more than that 120 hours. It didn't take long to figure out, all right, I got to fly Joe regardless. I'll take out this 10-hour day and write 2, and now I got another 8 hours out. All right, so that's why make those rules in combat. Let's see, where am I here? Typical day for a pilot, we wake them up at 5 o'clock. They'd be ready to go. They'd get their meals, they'd get briefed. Co-pilots would go out and check the aircraft, make sure there weren't any bullet holes. Pilots and commanders go out and get their briefings on what units are going to do, what call signs and all that stuff. And usually by 7 o'clock in the morning, they were all taken off. When they came back at the end of the day would vary. The assault, where we sent out 10 helicopters together all day long, they were generally back about 4 or 5 o'clock because the infantry didn't want to be putting people in just before dark. So their day was done. The single ships that went out for ash and trash to move people or medical or water or whatever, sometimes they'd come back 7 or 8 o'clock at night, sometimes in the dark. That was a variable. I'm sure somebody looks at this now, they have a complete heart attack. But to me, my longest day, there was a period of time that we thought we had a lead on one of our downed air crews. The infantry captured a Vietnamese that the day before had been with one of our lost pilots. The day before. And we went through everything in the book to try to circle that area and try to find him. We never did. But I actually in one day put in 12.8 hours of flight time between about 7 a.m. and we came back about 10 o'clock at night. That was a long day. All right? That was a long, long day. Okay. What is a combat assault? A combat assault is the insertion, and sometimes the extraction of troops into a landing zone, what we call an LZ, everything's abbreviated. We flew as a flight of 10. If the LZ was big enough, we'd land 10 at a time. If the LZ wasn't gonna fit 10, we'd go in a flight of 5 and then another flight of 5. There were times we'd go in with flights of 2, 2, 2, and 2. It depended on the size of the LZ, the shape of the LZ, and what we did. What we preferred to do is go into a flight of 10. Typically, we did trail. Now, I've got an older group here, so most of you have been, as a kid, you went to those little firing ranges, BB guns, and you saw those little ducks that would fly down, ducks would move down, and you pick one and shoot it. Well, we go into those landing zones, the flight of 10, all in a row. But the advantage of that is you had a machine gun on either side. So if we were in a line, straight line, your door gunner could fire out left and right. There were times that we'd have to bunch in and close up. And if you were close to each other, you basically masked one or the other of the machine guns. So that's why trail was the preferred method of going in. But again, it was LZ dependent. I was never a part of this, but I'm sure that somewhere they learned the last artillery round, every landing zone that we'd into that was potentially a combat location, the artillery would prep it. They'd fire into it. They'd fire into that for maybe 6, 7 minutes. The last round would be Willie Pete, white phosphorus, and that would mushroom out. It's phosphorus, big white cloud. That was the way for the helicopters to know now we're going to fly into the LZ and the artillery's not going to shoot us down. I'm sure somewhere before I got there, they learned that lesson the hard way too. Yes. Yes, we weren't using it to burn people. We were using it as a very clear visual sign that that was the last round for the infantry. But yes, it's a burning big white cloud. Okay. After the artillery fired their white phosphorus, we knew we were safe to go in. Then the Cobras would prep it. If we were receiving fire, then they'd go and fire onto that known location we were taking fire. If not, they'd still fire into what they thought were likely locations. And depending on the jungles, you can usually pick where the enemy is going to be. They're not going to be out in the field where you can see them. They're going to be hiding somewhere in a tree line, and whatever tree line is close to the landing zone. So they would fire in the most likely areas. When we were going in and we knew we had troops in contact, we could call on our big brothers, Aerial Rocket Artillery, abbreviated as ARA. Again, they were Cobras with extra pods, and they could fire all these rockets into it. Right? And that would suppress the enemy from firing on us. In theory. Flight landing in various formations, I've covered that. We would generally never touch down. We'd get down to the ground, brake or slow down, and just hover, and the infantry guys would jump out. Now, this is one of those ironies in life. As pilots, I could never get the idea I wanted to go in the jungle and patrol through. I did that in the Panama Jungle Warfare School, and that was enough to convince me I really don't belong in the jungle walking through the woods. The infantry guys, they didn't like to be in helicopters. They'd want to get out of that helicopter as quickly as they could get. Am I correct, Ken?
I kind of liked it, actually, but once I got out, nobody knew what was going to happen.
Well, he's crazy too. So.
I liked flying. It was fun, but again, as you said earlier, it took a lot of places I didn't want to go, but became a doctor from a lot of places I didn't want to be.
Places you want to get out of, right? You got to remember the good side. Okay. Yeah, we very rarely touch down. And if I'm okay on time-wise, I'll tell you one of the somewhat funny story. Flight of 10, and I was just in the back aircraft. That's the time I get my flight time. There'd still be a flight lead and everything else. I'd just sit in the back and wiggle a stick and enjoy myself. Went in as a flight of 10. It was a rice paddy, and one of the infantry guys jumped out a little too soon. Well, it was soft rice paddy. And I had no idea he wasn't out of my aircraft. It was somebody in front of us. But he jumped out and basically implanted himself in the rice paddy. So as all the troops break to the wood line to get out of the way, and this was a hot LZ, there's incoming fire. All the troops break out, and as we started to lift out, the crew chief says, "Hey, there's one guy there still standing there. Look at his arms waving." He was stuck in the mud, could not get himself out. So I broke, being the last aircraft, I broke, covered down. He grabbed his arms around the skids, and we basically sucked him out of the rice paddy. Right? Now, I happened to look back just at the time as we sucked them out of the rice paddy. And I will never in my life see a more grateful face than what I did that day. You know that, I'm sure that guy would want to kiss me if he could have, but you know, we got him out of the rice paddy, dropped him again, and off we went to the woodline. So, kind of an interesting story. I've never seen him again, but I'm sure he still thinks about that day. This is a painting done for the First Air Cavalry, actually 229. This is a symbol for our battalion. You'll see here you got a flight of 5 that have just dropped off the infantry troops, and they're heading for the wood line. And right behind them, probably the LZ was not big enough for all 10, right behind them is the other flight of 5. So this is a very good, I mean, it's an artist sketch, but it really shows what we didn't have. Each of these Hueys would carry 4 grunts. All right? Now again, I call them grunts, and I've had somebody say afterwards, "What's that, a derogatory term?" Now, grunt was quite a good term. I mean, it recognized what the infantry guys did. They grunted all day long with the loads they carried. Most of these guys were carrying, no matter what they weighed, they were carrying 80 to 100 pounds of gear. So grunt is I'm not being derogatory. All right, mission notes. Rice paddies, although we flew mostly in the mountains and jungles, but we did occasionally southern part of 3 Corps fly into rice paddies. They were great. I mean, it was like a nice flat level area. Most of what we did was jungles and mountains, and therefore we'd have to go in. As I said, there were times we'd go in only 2 at a time. We wouldn't do this for combat assaults, but when the situation required it, let's say somebody was either wounded or broken legs, all those things happen. You know, somebody gets diarrhea in the middle of the jungle and you can't keep up with the troops or whatever it may be. Sometimes you had to get a guy out and they were nowhere near a landing zone. So what do? They get that C4 explosive and they wrap it around several of the trees and they detonate it and they blow a big hole in the jungle. And then we could come back with the helicopter and cover into it. Now it would be an outward cone, but the lower we got down to the ground, the more we had trees. And I can recall crew chief would be watching your tail in the back and he said, "Move the tail left, move the tail right." And by the time we got down to the ground, there was not a clear shot up. You had to go up and keep moving your tail around the trees to get back up. But you do that if somebody was wounded or just had to be extracted no matter what. And hover hole, we really call it a hell hole. It's pretty descriptive. Medevac, we were not, our primary mission was not medevac. The CAT did have specifically set aircraft for that. On the other hand, when you're in a hot LZ and you're taking in whether it's ammo or food or whatever it may be, water, and there's somebody wounded, you're going to take them back. The disadvantage with us pulling medevac is we had no medics on board. We didn't have blood transfusion capability, all those other things. And if we had to have a medic to take care of that wounded soldier, then it meant you were stealing the medic from the infantry that you were pulling them out of. So it varied. We didn't have as a primary role, but there were times we did. And, you felt pretty good about doing a medevac. We would fly at max speed, and typically in 3 Corps, a wounded soldier, once we got him on board the helicopter, 18 to maybe 24 minutes, we could have him back into Saigon at Hotel 3 at the 94th medevac. And that's why it had such a much lower casualty rate. Nowadays they talk about the golden hour or somebody after an accident and so forth. We could move almost anywhere in 3 Corps relatively quickly. But we fly that helicopter as fast as we go. It was shit. Nobody ever complained. Typical day for a flight of 10 would be maybe a dozen combat assaults, and that varied. But one thing to understand is they were not all hot. There was not an enemy in every landing zone. You could go out, and I recall one time we went almost 2 weeks without anybody shooting at us, and the pilots were getting antsy. It's like, did they cancel the war and not tell us? Let's go home. On the other hand, when you get shot at day after day, you think, I like the other idea better. It varied. There was no routine. So every combat assault was a potential for things hitting the fan, but you didn't know that until you were in the LZ. Now, what we did do, and I talked with other pilots from other units, they didn't all work this way. But the men, let's go back. The mentality in the cab was to pick a fight and don't stop. We had hard times. In 70, 71, we spent most of it trying to find the enemy. The only time you really found the enemy easily is when he set up an ambush for it, and he wanted to walk into it, fly into it, all right? The other times you'd have to go looking for them. But once we found them, whether we put in a platoon or a company, that'd be the first response. And then if they were in any way threatened or felt they were going to be overrun or overwhelmed, you'd add another company, you'd add another company. I think the greatest example, I forget what month now, I'm just drawing a blank, but at the Paris Beach, which is the border between Cambodia and Vietnam, the worst day I was a part of, we lost 11 helicopters in one day. But at the end of that day, we owned that landing zone. Spent the next 2 days picking up all the wrecked helicopters and everything else, and then moved off and did it all over again somewhere else. But that was our worst day, with the loss of 11. And I'd say of those 11, I'd say half of them were destroyed completely. It was pretty bad battle. But that was the first CAD mentality. Once you find the enemy, you keep adding troops in there, and in there. And if you could, put troops behind them so you box them in and can't get away from them. This is a stateside picture. You can see here that's not a road to Vietnam. But there's your typical Hueys flying with our good friends, the Cobras, in support of us. Just a nice photograph. This is definitely my unit, the 229, coming in. Because you see troops standing here, because you see the troops standing here, this is us coming in to pick them up and take them somewhere else. All right, so this is like the loading phase to go somewhere else to do a combat assault. Otherwise, they wouldn't all be standing up like that way out in the open. You see how close the helicopters fly when they need to. Really tight. And that was so that the Cobras, the smaller we are, the easier it is for the Cobras to put suppressive fire on our left or our right or whatever. You don't like them shooting across your tail. Flight of 10s could carry 60 troops. Again, with the loads they carried, that was it. That was the maximum load, 60. I can recall a time lifting out of an LZ in Cambodia where we had something like 14 Cambodians. But they were little guys. They weren't carrying 100 pounds of gear and everything else. And that was easy. That was, we're almost overloaded. So if 60 troops wasn't enough to take control of that landing zone, you went back and got another 60. You went back and got another 60. If time permitted. I think the largest assault, this was right after we had that information about our lost pilot. There was one mission we did that we had 70 Hueys in the air at the same time. 70 Hueys. And I never did count the Cobras. But flights of 10, 7 flights of 10. That's a lot of troops being put in the ground. Major effort to try to find that guy. Extractions are much more risky, okay? As I said, pile on. The enemy knew that if you know they attack that first set of 60, then you're going to go get more and keep adding to it. On the other hand, the extraction is when you're pulling it back out. So maybe you've got 300 troops there. They're not going to start firing at 300 troops. They're going to wait until you take 60 out and 60 out. And eventually get down to that last final set of 60 guys. And up until then, they're along the perimeter, seeing to it the enemy couldn't get to the jungle wood line to fire on it. Well, then they've got to move from that jungle wood line in to get to the Hueys so we can get them out. So extractions were definitely a pucker factor, especially if the unit had been in contact for the period of time they were in that landing zone or that area. You knew when you were doing extraction, that last flight was going to be exciting. There were times, though, that we reversed things on the enemy. Not that we had it planned, but in fact, if they hit our 60 guys trying to come out and hit them hard, what would we do? We should get the guys we just took out and put them back in again. And you start adding them back in. That taught the enemy a little bit, too, to maybe you don't want to hit us on the way out, but it varied. Okay. This is a newer slide for me because I gave it at a college a few months back, and in the audience was a helicopter pilot. And he met me after I didn't know he was there at the time, but he met me afterwards, and we got to talking about what did we do and how did we do it? I took this as gospel. When I got in country, I was told by one of the warrant officers when I was just a young Peter pilot, that here's how we do it in the CAD. That you as a helicopter pilot don't make the call on whether it's risky or not to go into that landing zone. It's up to the ground commander. That's the guy on the ground. That's the guy whose life's on the line. That's the guy that knows how much of the enemy's there, what weapons they're firing at, whether they're from one direction only or whether they've got them encircled or whatever it may be. So the infantry guy really does know what's best on the ground. And in the first cab, that's the man that made the decision for us to go into landing zone. If you've watched that movie of We Were Soldiers Once and Young, the Hueys went in under fire and the medevacs pulled out. So it's too hot. We're not risking our helicopters to do that. We didn't do that in the cab. If the ground commander said, come in, you came in. He maybe give you heading directions and tell you what enemy weapons were there or where they were. Sometimes you come in from one direction and go out the other. But you had to do that. Now, we heard that, and I remember I was in country probably for at least 6 months before I was out on the mission, and it was a single helicopter. Flight of 10, you always had that mentality. They're not shooting at me. They're shooting at the other 9 helicopters, right? They can't possibly want to. They're not mad at me. Well, you're a single ship. There's no doubt who they're firing at. And we had been out doing action trash logistics for an infantry unit, and one of the companies got hit, and they got hit hard. And first thing we heard about is go back to the fire base, get ammo and water. Don't bring anything else. We just need as much ammo and as much water as you can carry. So they loaded us up, and out we go to where this company is. And this company commander didn't really have a sales technique. What he said to me was, we're under fire, 360 degrees, automatic weapons in almost every quadrant, and you're probably not going to get in here completely. You get as close as the landing zone as you can before you crash. I know you're not getting out of it. Not a good sales pitch. And my mind was going for like a second to think like, wow, this is really serious stuff. Crew chief in the back that I've been flying with a good number of times was from Alabama. Therefore, his name was Rebel. And in that split second, my mind's thinking about, holy crap, this is bad stuff. Rebel lets out one of those rebel yells, said, this is going to be fun. We went in and we took a lot of hits, but we really did get in and get out. We just threw that ammo out. Nobody came out to us. We weren't going to get up and stand up or anything else. We just threw the ammo out either side in the water. But we got out, and that wasn't one of the times we were shot down. So my point for you here, several things. The first air CAF, you had to trust the ground commander, and we had teamwork. All right. So as I said, I was in country about 7 months with just the first CAF, and I thought everybody did it that way. Well, having talked to the other pilot, that wasn't the case. A lot of the other helicopter pilots, if they thought the landing zone was too hot, they'd pull back out. But again, when you work with those infantry guys day in and day out, do you really want to face them next month or next week and say, hey, that landing zone last week where I wouldn't come in to get you? That wouldn't work very well. Yes, Ken?
Well, didn't have to come in to bring water and ammo. Our pilots had to bring us water and ammo if we needed it. Nothing else, but they had to do that. They had to come to not have.
And they couldn't wave off?
No, not if you were short ammo and water.
Well, that's good. What unit? I know you told me and I forgot.
I'm American.
American. Right. The pilot I was talking to was one of the first 88th Brigade, where this week they work for this guy and the next week they're here and there. So they didn't have a set thing. And in fact, it was the pilots that made the decision to win or not. I don't want to say it's great to be relieved of that responsibility, but it took some fortitude to say, I trust you, here I come. All right, there's a typical single ship mission where the helicopter can't even land. He's dropping the guys off on a ridge line, and you can see they're jumping. This guy's actually in the air. I don't know whether you drop them 3 or 4 feet or whatever it may be, but one at a time they go out. This was kind of scary when I was a new pilot, because you got weight and balance, and these guys jump out. They're not saying, "Hey, come and win." So suddenly you lose 200 pounds on this side. The helicopter's going to go this way, and you're back and forth. That was scary at times. And I remember having to do that where I had one skid on a log. It was a steep mountain. There was a tree that had been knocked down, and I could put one skid on the log that sort of gave me a reference. And then these guys are jumping out both sides, and it's rock and roll. Neat. Okay, special missions we did. Nighthawks. That's an old term. I didn't know it at the time in Vietnam, but that's an old term left from the Western days when they sent the cowboys out to watch the herd at night. They were called nighthawks. Well, we had nighthawks, and generally all pilots pulled this mission, but maybe once every 2-3 weeks. It was a variable. It was like an extra duty, so to speak. But we'd send a specially equipped helicopter. It had the old night vision. Now, nowadays you have these night vision, you see it all on these TVs, where each individual looks around and it's green, but you can see it. We didn't have any of that in Vietnam. You know, what you saw was with your eyeballs, day or night. But in the back of the helicopter, you had big, I mean, it was probably almost a 30 by 30 inch night scope. And the guy behind that could see at night, again, that green tint. And mounted co-point with that was a Xeon type searchlight, type of searchlight they put on tanks. I don't remember now what the candle power was, but it would light up the sky. So you fly around in the dark and you try to find the enemy with your night vision scope. We had 2 covers with us, and if we found them, typically you're looking for convoys and trucks on the road, you get the covers in position and you give them a heading. And when the covers told you that they were ready, you switch off the night vision scope, put on the Xeon searchlight. Now it's broad daylight, and the cobra can roll in hot. That had some unique features to those kind of missions. And over a period of time, the enemy learned that single helicopter flying in circles at night probably meant nighthawk, and get off the road or hide so that we couldn't find. It was a unique experience to do this. The other one, I think I'm still all right time-wise. The other one was, the enemy always learned that if they were going to hit a fire base, they'd try to hit you at night, because they thought, all right, at night you can't get as much support. You can't get as much infantry to take care of it. This particular night when they hit a fire base, it was low overcast clouds. So at that point, the enemy on the ground figured helicopters can't fly in this. This is a perfect night to hit them. Well, I was on Nighthawk that night, and we did carry these big, huge flares. How are you going to drop a flare over a fire base that you can't see? Well, in Saigon, you have what was called Paris control, radar. So Paris control, we gave the coordinates of where this fire base was. Paris control by radar directed us relatively over the fire base. We dropped the flare down. We were above the clouds, big bright light, and it disappears. It went into the clouds. And for the guys under the cloud base, suddenly this glowing light would go out and then light up the LZ. They'd tell us whether we were left, right, north, south of where they wanted it. We were flying a racetrack pattern by the radar's guidance, and then he'd tell us when to drop the next flare. And we did that for almost an hour and a half. And I'm sure the enemy on the ground figuring out how in the world are these candle tower lights coming on out of the sky. I should have had a picture of that. That was pretty awesome to see that light just slowly clear out as it went in through the clouds. Let's see, did I cover everything here? Yeah, we covered that. Now there's another night, an older picture of Vietnam, just because of the this is probably an old A-model Huey, but I gotta admit, I never saw that patch on any aircraft in the first cab. It's like, here I am shooting. You didn't have that, I don't know who did, but we certainly did. Here's a typical fire base. Fire bases are always put on the top of the mountains for elevation. One at the top of the mountains easier to defend. Now, are there a lot of flat mountain tops in Vietnam? Well, they weren't until we got there, right? So a typical fire base, you go in with infantry troops, you'd secure the area, they patrol around it, and then like 2 days later, you'd come in, and those Chinooks would bring in the bulldozers. And the bulldozers would level off the mountain. And then the bulldozers would create the berms. You know, these are all self-propelled 155 howitzers. Bulldozers would create the berms, they create the ammo bunkers, and then this is basically a fire base. This happens to be, I think, just probably artillery, well, predominantly artillery, certainly there would have been infantry all around. All around. Now, this kind of fire base, you see, there's very little green, so we wouldn't land helicopters in here because that would create a dust storm that would just destroy everything. That's a typical fire base we support. Who did we support? I love this because here's another old man. This is the company commander at 23 years of age, responsible for about 45 people, responsible for life and death of those 45 people. You know, that's the guy who would say, all right, we're going to go out on patrol. I have to have a point man. You pick your favorite guy as a point man, or you pick the best point man. You know, he did rotate. But those are tough decisions when you're talking. And then the troops that he's supporting, I mean, look at him. 18, 20 years old. This guy here looks like Bruce Levin, but it's not. Young kids, but young kids fight very well. I think all of us had that, initially had that mental mindset that we're invincible. It didn't take but about a month or so in country to realize that, hey, that ain't true. But he did it. Okay, how are we doing time-wise?
That's 10 after 8.
Okay.
There's 20 minutes.
20 minutes. I want to leave time for questions and answers. All right, I'm doing okay. If time permits, I'll just throw some of the things out. What if you want to get somewhere and the enemy, you know the enemy's there, some of our sniffer missions. We used to fly Hueys with a big hose sticking down, about 15, 20 feet. And there was an air machine that would suck that air in. And then when the air was sucked into this machine, it would test, what's the right word? It would test for men's pity. It would, help me out, what's the chemical? Ammonia, the ammonia in your urine. And in fact, again, we'd fly low and slow, which made us great targets, but you'd fly this little hose thing sucking up the air and you'd find these concentrations. Well, sometimes we find concentrations of monkeys. Sometimes we find concentrations of the enemy. And then you did what you had to do. And in fact, right toward the end of my tour, I remember finding a concentration of elephants. But they were enemy elephants. They had straps and all the right gear. So unfortunately, we had to treat them like enemy trucks. Oh, I just broke it. Put it back together. If you couldn't, you knew where the enemy was and you couldn't get to them because there's no landing zones, you'd call in your buddies from the Air Force. Now, it took them a lot. The Air Force wasn't on call like our Hueys were. But the Air Force would send over a C-130, one of the big cargo planes with the deck in the back, and they'd roll out on wheels this 1,500-pound bomb. And on the nose of the bomb, it had whiskers. So this thing would drop out of the sky, and as soon as those whiskers hit the top of the jungle, it would explode the bomb. And it would make a hole in the jungle. Most of those trees are 100, 120 feet high, dense trees. And that 1,500, we call it a daisy cutter. That would make a hole big enough generally to fit in 2 Hueys. The only disadvantage of doing it that way, we learned the hard way, is you had to give enough time for all that dust to settle. I recall getting into one daisy cutter, a little anxious to get there and see what we're going to find. And we picked up so much dust, we basically lost our visuals. And I was lucky enough to just go straight up to get out of it. But the daisy cutter was an awesome thing to see. About my last 5 months in country, we started getting what we call special missions. We started going back into Cambodia. Now, when we first invaded Cambodia, I was down in Panama going through jungle warfare school because they thought pilots should know how to get out if they shot down in the jungle. But for the first 7 months in Vietnam, the old pilots would say, should have been here when the real war was on. Should have been here when we went into Cambodia. You'd have really seen some action. So for 7 months, I heard that. And then I got called down to Saigon, briefing by a general. And he said, well, we're going to start sending you into Vietnam or into Cambodia on special missions. And he started giving me all the rules. And I started talking about this with somebody just beforehand. We had to paint out U.S. Army on the tailgate. Now, who are you going to fool? A Huey looks like a Huey. So the fact that it doesn't say U.S. Army, I was like, you got to be kidding. All right, so we had to do that. We're not to land in Cambodia. But if you do land, you can only be down for 3 minutes. Well, that one rule makes sense because you spent more than 3 minutes on the ground in Cambodia where there's no friendlies. You were going to be there forever. But there again, the next rule was that if you do land, you can only land within 100 miles of the border. You know, some really strange rules. In the end, I left that briefing with the idea that whatever rule they give you, the next rule told you what you're going to do after you violate the previous rule. Which meant really, to a 24-year-old kid, there's no rules. And that's how we went back into Cambodia. Not with U.S. troops. We were flying special forces, long-range reconnaissance alerts. We were flying CIA. We were flying people in civilian clothing with golf clubs, bags. Only there weren't golf clubs in the bags. But, you know, we do those kind of missions. Now, as an example, here we are in Europe. Imagine somebody saying, all right, Buck, I want you to fly from here to someplace in New York State. You're going to pick up such and such an individual or 3 or 4 people. And now you're going to fly from New York State into, let's say, New Hampshire. And from New York State to New Hampshire, you're over just enemy territory. There's no friendlies. There's no Americans. There's nobody there that's going to come for it. We did that with a single engine. Single transmission. Now, that kind of a mission could be exciting. And over a period of time, I learned I had to start keeping a rotation to see what pilots had done that and when it was going to be their turn to do it again. Now, I'm sure every one of you here thinks, oh, it's your turn, you got to do it. I had to keep that rotation to see to it that they all got their equal share. They all wanted to go on those special missions. And again, you think about what it says for those air crews. They volunteer for almost anything. And in fact, after those special missions got a little bit better known, you know, the pilots at the bars were all talking to each other. I had pilots from other units coming to me and first trying to bribe me with beers. I'm a tough guy, I can't be bribed by beer. They were even offering me money to let them fly on our missions into Cambodia. Just an amazing mindset that they did. Offered money, I covered that. This really occurred that now we are safe back in Vietnam. On one of our missions back, as we crossed the border, you had to check in with the Air Force as you crossed over. So they knew it was a U.S. helicopter, not an enemy or whatever. Crew chief actually came on the intercom and said, thank God we're safe, we're back in Vietnam. And it was about a minute later before somebody else said, you know, it's true, but it sounds awfully stupid to think that, yes, I'm safe now that I'm back in Vietnam. On one of my missions, I was with the Cambodian general. Understand I was just a captain. Diplomacy and all that stuff was not my skill. They could speak Cambodian, which we couldn't. That's my daughter laughing about my diplomacy. Cambodians could speak French because the French had been in Cambodia so long. Well, luckily I had a crew chief that took high school French. So between my crew chief and this general and so forth, they fed us a meal, and then he got down to the negotiations. And what he wanted from us, first and foremost, he wanted automatic weapons. Well, they're all serial numbered. You know, even in Vietnam, you still had to track for where you were. And they said, I can't get your weapons. Next thing he wanted, batteries for his radios. Gotcha. I'll get you batteries for your radios. And in fact, what they were trading us was communist weapons. Some of it's still in the cosmic, brand new communist weapons and so forth. We bring those back, and I got several of those and then pass them out to the crew chiefs and mechanics. Never did bring one home for myself, but I gave them to the guys that didn't get to fly over there. And as a closing thing, what was the final thing this guy wanted? Playboy magazine. Now I gotta tell you, I said to the crew chief, you don't have that right. He can't be asking for that. I don't want to create some international incident here. Go back and challenge what he said. And after this back and forth, they really did. This is a general. Third priority is Playboy magazines. Kind of cute. All right, I think I'm good. Yes. So I'm open for questions, and I'll try to give you answers. 10 minutes? Thank you. Come on, folks. Somebody's got to ask a question.
How much fuel was in a Huey, and approximately how long would that last?
Okay.
Once you got filled up?
Fuel was measured by pounds. We fill up to a certain weight in pounds. A Huey could fly, it would vary a little bit, it could fly for close to 2.5 hours. We were limited typically to fly only 2 hours and had a half an hour reserve. Sometimes you didn't do that. And of course you were risking it. And I can recall one time in Cambodia where an aircraft was shot down. This was not my flight, but one of the others. The Huey went back, had just left Cambodia, crossed into Vietnam, heard that another ship was shot down, turned around, went back and rescued that loach pilot. But on the way back from Cambodia into Vietnam, he ran out of fuel. And in fact, the higher echelons were really upset about that and grounded that pilot for 30 days because he hadn't, obviously he was a hero to that loach pilot. Had they not, you couldn't be on the ground in Cambodia for a length of time long before you got captured and killed. So he was a hero to one guy, but the senior echelon said, no, he should have landed somewhere under power. Well, just the senior staff, they have no idea what the hell the jungles look like. I mean, had this guy seen a safe landing zone, I'm sure he'd taken it, but there wasn't one. But, he went beyond to where he had fuel starvation. So 2 hours was normal. I think I've gone as much as 2 hours and 20 minutes. I was a nervous Nelly at that point in time, because your flight career's about to end if it cuts out. Other questions? Yes, sir?
Hey, did you ever fly out prisoners?
No, I did not. I've seen a few Hueys that did occasionally, but it was rare. Most prisoners would go out by ground to, even if the U.S. captured them, they'd be turned over to the Allvets, the Vietnamese. In Cambodia, we used to take, we call them kidnapping missions. We'd go find enemy soldiers in Cambodia and fly them into the States, fly them into Vietnam and turn them over to the Vietnamese. Didn't often fly them from there back. Whether they got back or whether they got, stayed there, who knows? But no, captured enemy in Vietnam rarely put into use in any of the aircraft. No other questions, folks?
I saw, I was in Dong Ha trying to get a flight out and back. And this is when Khe Sanh was opened up again. We were up at DMZ pounding it for 50 days or whatever. The whole sky was lit up with Hueys, hauling Hueys. Never saw that. In other words, a crashed Huey was
Being lifted by a Huey?
lifted by a Huey, and I bet it was 20 of them at least, coming back from Khe Sanh.
I really don't think the Huey could lift
And
you.
they did it.
Yeah.
They had the blades off the bottom helicopter.
Yeah, you always take the
They
blade
had
off.
the blades off the bottom, and
Yeah. We always use Chinooks. I can't
yeah, well,
imagine.
we used it up for artillery and everything else, but I never saw that. Never even heard of it. And I'm watching this.
Pretty
That's
awesome.
whether they were South Vietnamese or American, who knows what that was going
Yeah,
on there.
Air America flew Hueys with twin engines. And whether or not they could have been twin engine Hueys that.
I never
had
saw
the
it,
extra
I
power
never even
to-
heard about it, But I mean, I saw it in my eyes and I swear to God, that's what it was.
I believe it. Okay, there's another question here.
Well, subject still flying?
No, well, let's go through that. I made captain in Vietnam. Again, the needs of the service. I was a second lieutenant for 1 year, first lieutenant for 1 year, and made captain in Vietnam. Nowadays, to make captain, you probably put in about 8 years. And yet we did it 2 years because that's what the Army needed. I spent 11 years as a captain, then made major, as an aviation company commander as a major, then made lieutenant colonel, was on battalion staff, great staff, and then created my own aviation battalion. I actually stood up with the Pennsylvania Guard, 2nd to 104th Aviation Battalion. Then made full bird colonel as Brigade XO, and then served with the, I had, of my 33 years, I flew for 28 of those 33. Very rare for a commissioned officer, but I was lucky. And then toward the end of my career, to get promoted again, I had to give up aviation. And when I retired from PA Army Guard, I was a brigadier general.
Even as a civilian, not fly?
I had a son-in-law that had an airplane, and I flew that a little bit, but it wasn't as fun as helicopters. Even if you gave me a helicopter, going to altitude, flying point A to point B and landing, that's not the same thing as what you did what we did with Hewis. So doesn't have quite the same appeal. There was a hand back here.
What division of we're flowing for, the dispersing of Agent Orange? You know, the depolarization.
Right, the Agent Orange was predominantly done by Air Force aircraft. There were some cases where Hueys went out and did it, but it was, you know, what a Huey can carry in Agent Orange and spray is minimal compared to those big C-130s.
Oh, those are the ones that you get because of the payload.
Yes, because of the payload. So that, right.
I've got one of this coming off the road.
Uh-oh,
An old friend gets chills and goosebumps when he hears the deal, which you don't hear much anymore, but we talk about it. How about a pilot? You get that same reaction during the year?
yes, and I'll admit there's times I hear one fly by, I'll get up from my desk and walk over to the window and think, geez, you know, I wish I was still there. You know, flying in the States, I remember out there in the winter, you're freezing, your fingers are numb and your body's chilling. And, why am I doing this? But, you know, if I had a chance to go back and fly Hueys for the Army again, I'd do it in a heartbeat. Absolutely. And yes, that thrill, the wop, 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 it's always going to be there. All right. To the day we die, it'll be there. Okay. Yes, sir.
Real quick. So, Fort Indian Town Gap, today there was a long duration of helicopters in the sky. What operations are in Fort Indian Town Gap that they train?
Well, there's everybody goes to become an initial pilot and go to Fort Rucker, Alabama. Walters is closed down. They don't have that demand anymore. So to become a pilot from start to finish, Fort Rucker, Alabama. After you've done that, say I'm going to transition from a Huey to a Loach, or from a Huey to a Chinook, or whatever it may be. Fort Indian Town Gap is one of two aviation support facilities in the country. There's one in Fort Indian Town Gap, there's another in Arizona. So pilots from any state in the country that need to transition, say, into a Chinook, will come to Fort Indian Town Gap to do that transition. And once you're a pilot transitioning into a Chinook, it's probably about, well, it used to be about a 3-week course. You know, Monday to Friday type school transition. Gunships take a lot more, but Fort Indian doesn't teach you into Cobras. That's out in the Yuma where they've got all these big ranges to fire missiles. You know, use the minigun and not hit civilians and all those things. So it depends on which aircraft as to which facility you're going to go to.
Even if you can't see them, you sure can hear them.
Yeah, you can hear them, and yet you talk to somebody on the ground, and I still practice this when I hear a Huey. It's like, where's it coming from? Because that thud, especially a flight of 10, you know, we didn't sneak up on the enemy. They knew we were coming. They probably had enough time to clean their weapons, reload, check their ammo, and make a last call to mom, and then, oh, they're finally here. But it really is hard to judge where we're coming from. And a lot of times to go into an LZ that we knew was hot, we would go in low level, you know, treetop level. And then just as you made the clearing, you'd flare back, slam her down to the ground so that your exposure rate was quick. You know, minimum time in being exposed to enemy fire is kind of a good habit to have. So that was how we did it. But Indian Town Gap is still a very active aviation unit. Pennsylvania has an aviation brigade, which is, let's say, about 165 helicopters out of Indian Town Gap. And some of those are used for training besides just used by the Army National Guard. Yes, 2 minutes. Okay. Hey, I've never finished so quickly. I'm gonna write up the audiences, but not asking enough questions. Is that it, folks?
I got.
Yes, Rob.
When you come into a landing zone, did you know ahead of time how you were going to come in, 2 or 3, or I know it probably changed constantly.
Well, if there's infantry on the ground, they gave you all that information. If there wasn't, there was somebody that did an aerial reconnaissance ahead of time. So the flight lead that day, let's say we're going to go out and do 10 assaults. The flight lead, typically with the captain, with whoever is the flight lead, would be giving aerial photographs, taking usually about 3,000 feet of each landing zone. And then he sort of prejudge it. And then of course there were times you'd fly to an LZ and you have to do a go around because it's the wrong axis or, you know, it didn't work out just right. But yeah, they did at least have an aerial photo. Yeah. Okay, folks, I guess the game is up.
Can you actually feel when they're flying bullets hitting the helicopter, you know, can you like go 1, 2, 3?
Okay, no, I've never called enough to count them. You hear them. I mean, you think about a Huey, the noise, but you know, an incoming round has a totally different sound. And yes, when they go through the skin, it creates kind of like a ping. And with all that noise, you know it's incoming versus outgoing. About the only time I think I was really fooled, again, as a young pilot, we were going in an LZ on a slope, and the crew chief kept saying, bring her down, and a bunch of bamboo on my side. And I kept sliding away from that bamboo because, you know, my rotor blade's going to hit it. You know, that rotor blade is going 330 RPMs a minute. That's like 6.5 cycles a second. So I was shying away from the bamboo that I could see and slid into the bamboo on my right. And that rotor blade hitting fresh green bamboo sounds exactly like a machine gun. I mean, I can tell you, it scared the hell out of me. And what did I hear from the crew chief? I told you so. Rotor blades on bamboo do a nice little tree trimmer job. You get into tree branches that are more than like an inch or two, you'll start doing damage to your rotor blade. But there were times, you know, like if you got to get a wounded guy out of the hellhole, if you did damage to the rotor blades, they're replaceable. So go do it. No questions, Donna?
One question, but I don't know if it's too personal. When you came back, did you have any adjustment emotionally?
Well, I had a wife and I had a 7-month-old daughter that I hadn't seen. So therefore I had family support. I think that made a big difference to me. The other thing, I think I still had active duty. I had a contract with the Army to be a pilot. I had to agree to serve for 4 years. So I stayed in the Army. I stayed with military people. I was at Fort Knox, Kentucky, teaching AIT to scouts. So I didn't break from the Army. As I've talked to a lot of the pilots, or even infantry guys, my brother-in-law, infantry one day, flown out of Vietnam, transferred out of the Army, back to civilian life with no transition, nothing, just cold turkey. And that happened, and certainly I hope military now learns not to do those things. I can recall before Christmas, what they call early outs, and they needed to reduce the troop strength anyway. So let's say somebody had a date to leave 15 January, and they say, oh, we're going to send you home on the 20th of December. And I can recall missions going out to units on patrol in the field and saying, I want Joe Blow. And Joe Blow, what do you want me for? Because you're going home. Well, they never said no, but I can recall flying them from that jungle environment right into Saigon to put them on a civilian airplane. You know, military contract plane to fly them home. And in one case, I remember yelling at the crew chief, get his weapon, get his weapon. You know, the guy had just left the jungle like 15 minutes before. And you think about it, did he ever say goodbye to his friends? Did he ever have that, you know, as pilot, I can tell you our last night in country, we were drinking some beers. But that guy never had a chance to say goodbye. That's a hell of an adjustment. But it varied accordingly. But I think those having family support as well as having stayed in the military, I never had. I was crazy to start with, and I think you're starting to realize I'm still there. Okay, folks. Oh no, not you. What?
A lot of Vietnam veterans did not experience a welcome home, but you always tell the story about your fellow pilots who make sure that you got your transfer. Do you have time to tell that? Because you felt like the entire airplane of people welcomed and thanked you.
Okay, I'll tell that. Most married men would go to Hawaii for their 7 days R&R. Everybody was guaranteed a 7-day R&R, rest and recuperation, not rape and ravage, but rest and recuperation. Those that went to Australia or Thailand was the other R&R. But as a married man, but with having a newborn baby, she couldn't come to Hawaii. So I paid out of my own pocket probably like 2 months worth of earnings to get a civilian ticket from Saigon to New York City. And got down to Saigon the day that we were supposed to go out on this 7 days. And I think about it, it's a day and a half to get across, day and a half to get back. So that 7-day leave wasn't a hell of a long time, but I was gonna see my daughter. Get to Saigon and the ticket guy gives me a ticket, Vietnamese guy gives me a ticket to San Francisco. I said, well, where's the other ticket from San Francisco in LaGuardia? No other ticket. No, I'm paying to go. Hey, USA, same thing. That was his mindset. I'm getting you to the United States. That's all I cared about. And there were 4 or 5 of us that had tickets for the East Coast. And it was either, are you gonna go or aren't you? So we got on board the airplane, figured we'll work it out. We told the stewardess, and this is United Airlines, I want to give the credit to the right airlines. We told the stewardess as we went up to the pilots, and it's almost, in those days, it was almost a 24-hour flight from Saigon back into the States. By the time we got to San Francisco, the United Airlines pilots had a commercial helicopter waiting. We went to actually Oakland, which was the airport side. Commercial helicopter to take us from Oakland over to San Francisco civilian airport. There was a United Airlines flight that waited for us. Gonna choke me up. That plane waited for 3 days to take us east. Now, it was late in the day. We'd have lost another day had we not gotten that flight. And that's one color. Oh, and yes, if we got on the plane, the pilot had told me, you had to do this, didn't you? The pilot had told the people on board why he was keeping me. And as we got on board, they cheered for us. Yeah, so there is support. We've talked about this. All right, folks, I think we've done as long as we can here without getting ourselves in trouble. We'll never get invited back, right? All right, I thank you all for coming.